Now I've mentioned how spring length and stiffness will affect how the weight of your vehicle is held up off the ground, and also how far it will lean over in turns. I've also briefly mentioned how the weight of the oil in the shocks can change the speed at which the suspension can move and affect how bouncy it is or how quickly the suspension will react over bumps and jumps. But there are a few other little things, little tricks that you can use to adjust your suspension action without changing either your springs or anything about your shocks internals. Here you're looking at the right rear corner of the URC cutaway truck. I've got a spring on there, I've got some light oil in the shock, and I've got some preloads to set the height of the vehicle where I want it to be. But notice down here, there are multiple holes on the suspension arm or the A-arm where this shock can be mounted. Using these different mounting points will have a number of different effects on the overall stance and handling of the vehicle. Now for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to cover just a few of the most important and most basic ones. Now I hate to bring schoolwork into this, but I have to. There's a little bit of geometry that's going on here that's important to understand. The wheel is attached to the suspension arm. The shock is attached to the suspension arm. As the wheel moves, it's acting against the shock, but not directly. It's actually acting against the suspension arm, and depending upon where the shock is attached, it's going to have a different rate of effect on the movement of the shock. To keep things simple, let's just say it has to do with levers and fulcrums. You know how when you have a certain amount of weight on an object that has a pivot point, you try to push on it on the other end of it, depending upon where that pivot point is, it'll be easier or harder to actually move that weight. Well, it's the exact same type of effect on the suspension of an RC vehicle. By choosing different holes to mount your shocks to on the arm, you're effectively changing the length of the lever on each side of that pivot point. If you move the shock into one of the inner holes, it's going to be easier for the wheel to move the shock. There's effectively more leverage on it, whereas using the outer hole makes it stiffer. Now take a good look at this truck from behind. Ignore the fact that I've removed part of the spring from this side. What I've done here is I've changed the lower suspension mounting point of the shocks. On this side, I'm using one of the inner holes on the other side of the arm. Whereas on this side, as you saw before, I'm using the outer hole. The effect is that on this side, where I'm using the inner hole, as I said, there is effectively more leverage on the shock and spring. So this is now a softer side. The vehicle will be able to lean more in the turns, whereas on this side, it's much stiffer. Now, because the springs and the shocks are both attached at the same point, the effect of changing this distance here is going to have an effect on both the spring and the shock. So while the spring is softer on this side, the shock action is also softer. So what I've effectively done by moving this single shock in closer to the center of the chassis, farther in on the A-arm, is that I've both softened the spring on this side and I've softened the dampening or shock absorption action on this side. Just by moving one screw from one point to another, I've done the same thing as changing my spring and my shock oil. Oh, but it's not quite that simple. There are a couple other things that occur also. Well, there are more than a couple, but like I said, I'm only going to show you the most important and most straightforward ones. It's another one of those geometrical things. As you move your shock in closer, you're changing how far the suspension can extend on that side. So here I'm just going to lift the vehicle up off the ground, just a slight bit, and you can see how this side over here, where I'm using closer to the inner hole, the whole suspension is able to drop down a lot farther than on this side. On the left over here, my tire is just barely off the ground, whereas on the right, there's still some space underneath the tire there. So that's one of the additional effects that you're going to have, sort of a side effect of moving the shock position. is you're going to get more down travel to the shock, or more down travel to the suspension. And this is jumping ahead a little bit, but that down travel or that downward angle is a thing that we call droop. Now, droop has its uses, and of course if you're going off-road on some really rough terrain, you'll think, well, the more I can jack up my suspension, the better, right? The farther, the steeper that this angle can be, and the more that the vehicle can sit way up in the air, the better. Well, that's true to a point, but there are also some negative consequences to that, which I'll cover in later videos. For now, the one big thing that I want you to watch out for is the angle of the drive shafts. When you're dealing with the end of a two-wheel drive vehicle that is driven, or if you're dealing with a four-wheel drive vehicle, having too much range of motion of the suspension can actually cause binding at the universal joints, and that's a bad thing. Now I've switched to a different vehicle. This is actually my old racing truck, my Traxxas Rustler. Ignore the fact that the shocks are upside down on the back here. That's actually not a good idea, but it was something that I was experimenting with at the time. But what I want to point out here is that some vehicles actually give you the ability to adjust not only where you mount the shocks at the bottom, but where you mount them at the top. Now, most vehicles will only give you options for moving the mounting point either out or in. What that does is it changes the angle of the shock, similar to the way that we were changing the angle of it before. But as long as you are still attaching to the same point on the A arm, you're not going to be changing the overall rate of the spring and the shock. However, you are going to be changing how progressive it is. You see, when a shock starts out, it's at an angle. But as it compresses, that angle actually changes. The more the shock gets compressed, the closer it becomes to being at a right angle with the arm. The closer it is to a right angle, the faster, again, this is one of those geometry things, but the faster the shock itself is actually compressing for a given speed of movement of the suspension itself. By moving the upper mounting point of your shock out, you're making that extra speed come sooner, to put it in simple terms. The farther that you move it in, the slower it's going to be moving for longer before it compresses. Basically what that's doing is it's changing how direct and how immediate the shock action will occur. When you have your shock mounted farther out on the shock tower that's adjustable, you will have a stiffer rate right from the start. So your vehicle will feel more direct, and it will be less inclined to lean, and it will also respond to bumps much more quickly. It'll feel like a stiffer ride. Compared to moving it in, where it starts out much softer and then only gets stiffer as the suspension compresses. That's called the progressiveness.